A growing number of U.S. companies are cutting ties with Russia in response to the country's invasion of Ukraine. PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, and Starbucks, each announcing yesterday they have suspended business in Russia. Yale professor Jeffrey Sonnenfeld is keeping a running list of the now more than 300 companies that have pulled out of Russia. His latest piece for Fortune is titled, "The Great Business Retreat Matters in Russia Today, just as it mattered in 1986 South Africa." And Professor Sonnenfeld joins us now. Good morning. It's good to see you.
Good morning, Willie.
This has happened relatively quickly over the last couple of weeks. Major companies around the world, the biggest companies in the United States, cutting ties for the time being anyway with Russia. What's the practical impact?
The practical impact is enormous. As we saw with South Africa, and Bishop Tutu had, late Bishop Tutu had actually told me this in person once, how important it was to marry private industry with government sanctions. The government regulatory sanctions can do just so much, but we had 200 companies led by General Motors back there, and back in the late 1980s, that pulled out in South Africa, and that was a very powerful stranglehold. In this case, it's very important, both for symbolic reasons. These are luxury brands and critical technologies and things, but it also is a major employers. It's a massive impact on the economy. And that's really what we want to do here, is we want to create some hardship on the general economy, is Putin survives not just as a tyrannical bloody autocrat, but also the totalitarian aura that he's in total control of all sectors. If you can paralyze the economics, the civil sector, like Gandhi did, or like when the revolution against Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania, or Erich Honecker in East Germany, is when that civil society breaks down, you can get rid of the despot.
The question is, does Putin care about the suffering of his own people?
Not at this point, I would imagine, but he's going to have to eventually. There's a lot of caskets coming back from in this war back into Moscow. But my question to you is, our perception of Russia as Americans, it's probably framed up in Cold War memories and everything like that. But when you see an Apple store closing in Moscow and a McDonald's closing in Moscow, my question to you is, someday this war will be over. What happens then? Does anybody come back? Does it regrow?
That's not to be pandering, but an incredibly sophisticated question that explains why some very prominent brands were surprisingly late to leave. Usually in social change movements, and I've been doing this for 45 years, is that the businesses that are consumer-oriented are the first to get engaged. In this case, most of them were late. And the reason is they're worried about re-engagement later by alienating the general Russian populace that has their information filtered by Pravda and TASS. They don't know the truth, so they didn't want to alienate them. And these iconic brands, Levi Strauss and McDonald's and Coke and Pepsi, were brands of liberation back in 1990 in that spirit of perestroika. Right. And that's the problem that those companies had. They still have this one big happy family mindset that we're a bridge to freedom. That world is gone, and there's no gray, there's no middle ground. There's black and white. There's evil and villain and innocent victims.
And Michael Steele, this of course takes us back to the 1970s, to the 1980s. Would hear stories about bootleg Beatles albums making it around the USSR, bootleg Levi's, and there was such a yearning to get connected to the West by especially younger Russians. This obviously takes us back now, and I guess we were talking about how do we need a radio-free Europe to be more aggressive in getting the message out. By McDonald's, by Levi's, by all of these Western brands shutting down. That sends a strong message in itself, doesn't it?
It does, and I think it's an important message when you look back, Joe, at how corporate America has responded to big civil unrest moments here in the United States in the last 3 or 4 years, where they've sort of taken the lead. And I guess my question to Jeffrey would be, how does that feel for a lot of these corporate players? You get the bottom line concerns that they have, obviously. Russia is a big market to play in, obviously, like China or any place else. Do you think moments like this sort of raises not just the brand awareness about that civic engagement and involvement that they see here in the U.S., but now the opportunity to sort of have that play out globally for them? And what are some of the risks they may have to consider if that's the case?
Michael, that is such a critical issue. Is they've usually not been as engaged, other than, say, South Africa and certain targeted areas where the business community did engage. But yes, we have seen in the last few years in particular, amazingly, the trust in the business community has soared, with academia taking a step backwards, I guess, and certainly, sorry guys, the media, we've lost ground even with the clergy and with public officials. Business leaders have been ascendant in terms of all the trust surveys, and they've risen to the occasion on voting rights and on social and racial justice issues and gun safety and immigration. But on this one, a lot of these folks would rather almost shoot themselves and get involved in geopolitics, but they did. And what's also shocking is who did. The people who moved first were heavy industry, you know, BP and Chevron, or the Chevron's in Bob, but maybe Exxon and Shell. These are, you know, billions, $40–50 billion that they left on the table. Michael Dell, with Dell and IBM moving so early, it was astounding. Adidas, Nike, it's unusual who did, but the professional service firms, you never see the lawyers and the accountants jump into a fray early on, the consultants, Bain, BCG, McKinsey, Deloitte, EY. That's really exceptional. And I think some of it has to do with this Gen Z culture, not to make a tortured leap to the pandemic to endemic idea, but there's so much feedback inside these firms of vocal workers who can leave that it's not just the customers, but you look at the chat groups, people are furious and ashamed if their company's on the wrong side of history, and that's symbolically and substantively very important.
Senior Associate Dean and Lester Crown Professor of Leadership Studies at the Yale School of Management, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, thank you so much. And on that, more on that point as we close our show today, I think the effort to get to the Russian people, and I understand the services, the fries and things like that not being available.
Somebody said no fry zone.
No fry zone, but if there is any way to support getting information to them, that could be a way to undermine Putin.
Well, this is doing it, and this is one way to do it. I think we do need to be more aggressive in sort of a radio-free Europe sort of way in 2022. But think about this, Kathy. I mean, again, it's not just the government doing it, but firms, and firms that have been shamed by employees, whether it's huge oil companies that were late in moving, or McDonald's, Starbucks, other companies. It's having an impact.
Yes, bottom up, just like the protests around Europe and all of the action we've seen here in America. A lot of this is bottom up. This is politicians responding to anger of their own people who want to do something.
That makes a difference.
It makes a huge difference.
The combination of government and individuals along with companies.
And that's how you create that network you were just talking about. When people see the McDonald's closed, it automatically feeds, what the heck's going on? Why did that happen? And then when they get the message from their family in Ukraine, they begin to connect dots.
All right, Michael, Caddy, and Barnacle, thank you very much. For Willie, Joe, and me, that closes our coverage for today, but we'll be back tomorrow morning. That does it for us for now. Chris Jansing picks up the coverage right now.